Last session, we completed this part of our discussion, consolidated discussions on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra from standpoint of psychoanalysis. Essentially, standpoint of psychoanalysis and philosophy. We completed this discussion on general philosophical issues, the first 6 of them, and then we took up each of the philosophers and some schools of philosophy and spirituality, and my own model of the mind, HEAT. HEAT stands for Holistic Elemental Analysis and Therapy. So we completed this first part of our discussion on the theme of philosophy with reference to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra from standpoint of psychoanalysis and philosophy. Let's move forward. We now come to the metapsychology. Something not as away from the observation, direct experience as philosophy, and yet not completely science. Between philosophy and science, the area of metapsychology. The first metapsychological concept that Patanjali brings in is the concept of I-ness. And this is the root metapsychological concept of Patanjali. Psychoanalytic schools often start with the root concept of desire, which is also how many Hindu schools of spirituality started. But some schools, like the one of Patanjali, start with a root concept of I-ness. And this I-ness as a metapsychological concept needs some discussion to be understood. For that, we will have to get into the deconstructed elemental situation if we deconstruct the concept of ego, self, and personality. So let us slowly get into this complicated concept. In psychoanalysis, this concept is very simple. The concept is I and not I. At some stage in the development of the mind, the psyche comes out of the oceanic gestalt, and the idea of I and not I emerges in the mind. And there the I-ness is created. Psychoanalysis does not go into more elemental I-ness than this psychological I-ness. The psychological I-ness created early in childhood when you develop the concept of I and not I. But the yogic psychology, and Patanjali belongs to that tradition, he was in that context. It understands this I-ness in a deeper and a wider way. The Hindu philosophy and psychology tells us, spirituality essentially tells us, from the undifferentiated oneness, which is universal, when individuation takes place and the soul is created, the first sense of I-ness comes into existence. So the first realization of I-ness is that I exist, awareness of one's existence. Till then, even if there is I-ness, from a psychological standpoint, it is inoperative. It may be there from a physical standpoint, but from a psychological standpoint, it's inoperative. So there, the moment something separates from that universal oceanic whole, there is an I-ness. The I-ness can be, the I-ness first is that I exist. The second layer of I-ness is that I have these characteristics that may have to do with physical, biological, or psychological. In the human mind, it comes out as awareness of oneself. So the second layer of I-ness is the awareness of oneself. The third layer of I-ness is one's characteristics. The fourth layer is of one's self-belief and self-image. And the fifth layer is of the social image. The I-ness that I exist is coordinated with the concept of ego in the yogic psychology, very different from the concept of ego in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, ego emerges from the id, the primordial soup of id. Here, the ego is defined quite differently. So, the I-ness once created as one separate from the immensity is the first I-ness. The awareness of characteristics of oneself and experiences one has create the second layer of I-ness. The identification with the body and spreading out of this I-ness into the body create the third level of I-ness. The emergence of the spiritual self and the authentic self from this primordial identification with the body creates a second level of the third or fourth level of I-ness, and then creation of a social personality. And therefore, when we talk about the self, we go in the reverse. We start with the social self, the authentic self, the spiritual self, the system self, and the biological self. And then the psychic being, the real self, and the central being, the universal self. So we have 7 different concepts of self, and that is how the I-ness develops. And slowly one goes from the front to the primordial I-ness. And the giving up of this I-ness, that whatever is happening because of me. It is not a process independent of me which is happening in the system. And Patanjali talks about on the path of yoga towards samadhi, as we start working on ourselves, the surface self starts becoming weaker and they go away. So the social self goes away, then the authentic self, much of it goes away, part of it becomes deactivated. Then the spiritual self, much of it gets deactivated. Then the system self, much of it gets deactivated. In few people, it will be erased completely, but most people, it will be deactivated. And then one goes to the final sense of I, where it is the pure I, not the psychological I. And this I-ness is very different. And this is a very core meta-psychological concept in Patanjali, that unless we overcome this I-ness and just be in the system as a pure observer, where all the elementals are working according to laws of nature, without any intervention or desire guiding them from our side, samadhi cannot happen. So this I-ness he is referring to is not the I-ness of the Purusha, which of course is in a deeper sense an I-ness, but in an operative sense, when we talk about transformation, Patanjali refers to the I-ness in the form of the social I-ness, the authentic self I-ness, the spiritual self I-ness, and a large part of system I-ness. He leaves apart the Purusha I-ness as yet. Some Jain philosophers go a step deeper to annihilate even the Purusha I-ness. So do the Buddhists. But Patanjali stops at the psychological level. And then he says, the pure Purusha remains. And that also at some stage gets into the state of oceanic oneness, where this I-ness completely goes away. So I should not say Patanjali stops at that psychological level, because he does talk about the oceanic oneness where even this sense of I-ness goes away, and he calls it Nishabda Samadhi, the Nishabda, Nirbij Samadhi, where even this the I-ness that I exist will go away. But most of the times when he is referring to Samadhi, he is talking about all other I-nesses except the I-ness of the Purusha. But later on he talks about the seedless Samadhi, the Nirbij Samadhi, where one merges into the oceanic whole, and even this goes away. So in some parts of Patanjali we find the social I-ness goes away, authentic goes away, spiritual goes away, much of the system is deactivated, and then only the Purusha remains. And that is not termed as I-ness, but in later parts, even that Purusha is termed as a part of the I-ness. And this to Patanjali is the core, the identification of the self with any psychic process. Once the I is separated from the psychic process and you can see it as an observer, all the better is one. So it is only after this I-ness is established that I exist, and then the desire comes forth. Some people reverse the order. Say the I-ness is a tool of desire. That's also one way of looking at it. That this I-ness also is a tool of desire, and the core is desire, which is another way of looking at it. One way to look at it is the I-ness, I exist, is primary, and then I have a desire. That seems to be a more logical sequence. But if you put a question, why should I exist? Then the order will get reversed. Desire will come first. So for Patanjali, I-ness is a fundamental concept. Even if desire exists, but if we can detach and look at the desire, slowly the desire starts falling. But till I is entangled with desire, it's very difficult to get rid of desire. So from a transformation point of view, this seems to be more fundamental. From an ontological point of view, desire seems to be more fundamental. Then comes the question of desire, and Patanjali is very clear that the desire will lead to entanglement, involvement, and action, which in turn will create tendencies. And it is the I-ness which is necessary also for gratification of desire, that we gratify most of our desires in the mode of I-ness. We are not in the mode of Purusha. We are not in the mode of oceanic whole. We are not in the mode where the seer, the seen, and the process of seeing is one. We are in an ordinary state where I-ness is active, possessiveness is active, I versus the rest is active, And in that state, we satisfy our desire. So I-ness is a very core concept in Patanjali. Then Patanjali comes to the centrality of desire, and he says, till this is done through, compulsive ceaseless experiences cannot be stopped. Rebirth cannot be stopped. And the core of stopping the rebirth and the ceaseless activity of the mind is to work on this I-ness and desire. And first he says is the work on the I-ness and then work on the desire. Much easier. If you can detach yourself and look at the operation of desire, much easier than to be overwhelmed by desire and trying to be free from desire. In psychoanalysis, of course, desire is fundamental and nobody goes into the type of I-ness that Patanjali talks about. Even the concept of self is confused. In psychoanalysis, the Winnicott's true and false self is very different from Lacan's concept of méconnaissance as a false self, is very different from Jung's concept of the self, which is a structural component, is very different from Kohut's idea of a healthy self and unhealthy self, which are phenomenologically derived entities. So the word self is a confused word in psychoanalysis, and therefore what we need to do is to define different words: the social self, the authentic self, the spiritual self, the system self, and the biological self. The word ego can easily get confused here, but we have to separate the coordinator, the balance creator, from all other entities which are otherwise in their function, lost in their functions. Much of it to do with gratification. So we'll have to look at the ego as the coordinator, the facilitator, the orchestra conductor. Because otherwise it's very easy to expand the word ego and make it equivalent to the self. Whereas ego is an entity which works as the different parts of the self try to actualize themselves. And this is one of the difficulties with Kohut. How do you differentiate the ego and the self? Because they are linked also. Cohesion. Cohesion is common to both. There is a strong linkage between the strength of the self and the strength of the ego. And at times they appear so synonymous that it also becomes a question where we should, instead of using the 4 self, we should use 4 different aspects of ego. But it is better to keep the ego as the balancer between the id and the superego in the context of every self. So for Patanjali, the cessation of thoughts, which of course is not even a goal in psychoanalysis, can be done by working on desire, and it's a possibility to be free from desire. Again, not a possibility in psychoanalysis. The goals are different, the limits of human potential are different. Patanjali's metapsychology involves rebirth, and tendencies are carried forward. So we are dealing with, when we are dealing with pathology and constitution, we are not only dealing with events of this life, but of past lives also. That is where reincarnation research becomes very important. This is yet to come into psychoanalysis. I think in the next 15 years will at least take to get this thing, provided the reincarnation research convinces us of itself. Rebirth also brings in the element of individuation, because every birth has a purpose, not only account balancing of karma, but apart from that, there is a journey of life. Certain new experiences the soul has come for. And therefore, when we talk of Jung's concept of individuation, it is strongly connected to the cycles of rebirth, if we believe in rebirth. Because individuation in this incarnation will be very different from individuation of last incarnation, but will be connected to it in some way. Fourth metapsychological concept is the concept of karma. That karma of this birth and karma of past births, they both have impact on the way the mind works. And therefore, it would have an impact on pathology and the healing. Often we see the same thing does not take effect for a very long time, and then it takes effect. From point of view of karma, explanation would be the time has come because the bad karma has been exhausted, lived out, suffered, or worked through. From a strictly rational force field point of view, you have just repeated it enough number of times to acquire a force enough to overcome the force of pathology. Purpose of the psyche. It's a very important metapsychological concept. In fact, in the concept of karma, when we look at why somebody just doesn't get healed, one explanation Patanjali would give would be from a karmic standpoint. Purpose of the psyche is a very important metapsychological concept. Patanjali is very clear. The purposes are two. One is to have experiences, and second is to work for freedom from those experiences and overcome desire, freedom from desire. And that in turn leads to freedom from thought, freedom from affect, freedom from objects. And that ultimately leads to the state of no thought. And if deepened enough, can lead to various enlightenment experiences, including oneness, oceanic oneness with existence. Psychoanalysis does not go into the purpose of the psyche at all. Only Jung does in generality, where he says individuation, but he doesn't go into the specifics of it. Why individuation of a particular type only? He takes it as given that each has a path of individuation, and that is a given. Unconscious is a common metapsychological concept both to psychoanalysis and Patanjali. Here we see a confluence. In purpose of the psyche, the confluence would be on survival and pleasure. That both would agree that survival and pleasure are purposes of the psyche, apart from the non-agreements where Patanjali would say experiences for the soul and enlightenment. But on these two purposes, they would agree, survival and pleasure. The unconscious, Patanjali uses the word chitta, and that chitta in yoga is not only of this birth but of past births also. Patanjali talks of the superconscious also, the oceanic oneness, the state of kaivalya, the state of samadhi. So the mirror, the other extreme of the unconscious, the superconscious, also Patanjali talks about. But superconscious is missing in psychoanalysis. And the unconscious of psychoanalysis is strictly of this birth. In Patanjali, the unconscious is of accumulation of many births. The Purusha is a strictly metapsychological concept of yoga, does not exist in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, we have the participating ego, the observing ego, but the observing ego is not the same as Purusha, although at times it takes the point of the position of Purusha, becomes like Purusha. Purusha is a spiritual observer which can actually observe even the observing ego. And Purusha aims at transformation of more fundamental nature than only the intellectual transformation. So occasionally when deep transformations happen by inside generation of the observing ego, at those times the observing ego actually is the Purusha. That state is created. But the Purusha is not a metapsychological concept, but it is a concept of yoga and Patanjali. And this is the core concept, that the first thing to do is to get into the state of Purusha and observe the rest of the mind. So the Purusha is the core concept, and we have here Purusha and the Prakriti. All that is observed by the Purusha is Prakriti, including our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own energies, whatever we observe. And the idea here is when the Purusha is strengthened enough, what is observed slowly undergoes a sinusoidal wave, increases in intensity and then goes down and goes away forever. And then the Purusha is looking at the blankness, silence. And that is one description of state of enlightenment and samadhi. The metapsychological concept of knowing in Patanjali is very different from knowing in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, the knowing is the knowing of enlightenment, the Kantian knowing, what Immanuel Kant has described. A very rational, classical type of knowing. Even in that knowing, psychoanalysis has not really incorporated epistemology, but the knowing it talks about is the ordinary, everyday knowing. Patanjali talks about different types of knowing. Knowing which happens in states of samadhi, knowing which happens by identity, knowing which happens by being one in the process of engagement, where the seer, the seen, and the process of seeing is one. It can also happen because of samadhi. It can also happen because of taking certain psychedelic substances, reciting certain mantras, doing idol therapy or idol development process. So many things one can do and get to different states of knowing, and extraordinary knowing is possible by different types of samyamas. So Patanjali in chapter 3 devotes the chapter 3 to extraordinary phenomena, something we would talk in the human potential movement or parapsychology. Completely, so this chapter 3 is completely out of psychoanalysis. You would just dismiss it as fantasy or psychosis. But Patanjali is very clear that there are different ways of knowing, and the classical, rational, Kantian knowing of enlightenment type is only one ordinary way of knowing. And by doing different samyamas, extraordinary knowing, extraordinary knowledge is possible. One important element in Patanjali also is exhaustion of desire. That desire can exhaust. Psychoanalysis would never accept that desire can exhaust, but desire can exhaust, and it's a very concrete experience of spiritual practitioners that desire does exhaust, and the senses do retreat. And the exhaustion of desire is not only for spiritual seeker, but anyone who has lived life naturally will see that according to the age, different desires rise and fall, and the fall of many desires is as natural as the rise of certain desires age appropriate. Western civilization is powered by desire, especially put on steroids by corporate communication. So it's very unnatural for anyone from the West to even consider this possibility that desire can exhaust. But reality is their desire exhausts naturally. Also with age, many desires exhaust as they become age inappropriate. Not only because of social aspects, but by their very organic nature. So the exhaustion of desire is as natural as emergence of desire. Part of it is age driven. Part of it can be accelerated by spiritual practice. This is what Patanjali talks about, that desire can exhaust. This is what Gautam the Buddha also said. It's possible to be free from desire. This is what all spiritual schools say. How the desire exhausts, Patanjali doesn't go in details of it. He talks only about the eightfold path, and he says, when ordinary desire exerts itself, remind yourself of the suffering it will bring, and remind yourself of the bliss that enlightenment will bring, the freedom that enlightenment will bring, the cessation of births that enlightenment will bring. And it's this cost benefit analysis which will bring you back together on the spiritual path. Whenever there is a deviation or a fear of temptation because of the pull of desire. So Patanjali believes one of the core metapsychological concepts is the exhaustion of desire, and for that use a basket full of tools. Stance of the senses. This is also a very important metapsychological concept, not found at all in psychoanalysis. Patanjali says the senses are very powerful and they can overcome even a wise person. Even after attaining samadhi, the senses can re-exert themselves. Desires can re-exert themselves and overwhelm you and drag you back into ordinariness, at times even to evil. However, if one practices the state of samadhi long enough, then the senses withdraw themselves from objects and go to a state of rest. There is a sort of deactivation. And then the senses help us in preserving the state of samadhi by virtue of their own being at rest and by virtue of their using inertia to keep themselves at rest and help us in maintaining the state of samadhi. Sri Aurobindo also says the same thing, that initially nature opposes our spiritual effort, but after some time it helps our spiritual effort. He says somewhere, I think on the lines of let me not go there. Nature initially opposes and then helps. So the same is true of senses. Initially, Patanjali says senses are difficulty, but once mind withdraws, desire withdraws from objects, senses over time also learn to withdraw, go to a state of rest, and then the rest of the senses, the inertia of the senses actually helps us in maintaining, enduring state of samadhi. Not enduring in the sense of tolerating, but enduring in the sense expanding the sense of samadhi, the state of samadhi. Kaivalya, enlightenment as a goal state, is a central metapsychological concept of Patanjali, also of Hindu spirituality, also of most spiritual schools, that such a psychological state of freedom from thought, affect, object is possible, where there can be awareness, bliss, oneness with existence, pure observational status, dissolution into shunya or nirvana or zeroness. That is a goal state to which all individuals have to aspire to and work towards. Psychoanalysis does not have such goal state. Psychoanalysis has a goal which is very conservative, cessation of symptoms and the ability to work and love. freedom from impairment. And impairment is defined indexed to the average, not indexed to the ideal. Some concepts of metapsychology of Patanjali, therefore, are common to psychoanalysis. Some are unique to Patanjali. And therefore, if we bring these concepts into psychoanalysis, it enriches psychoanalysis. Difficulty is many of these concepts are experiential, involving rare experiences, and therefore difficult to prove empirically on a large sample size. Solution seems to be neurological exploration of these rare states, because there is no way to make these rare states common. So neurological exploration of these rare states will allow us to empirically prove their validity, their super healthy, super normal nature, desirability of those states. From there, we can go towards acceptance of these metapsychological concepts and then bring them into psychoanalysis. We complete the discussion on second aspect of consolidated discussions, metapsychology. We'll continue our discussions, taking it into the third structural component of our deliberations. Concepts used by Patanjali from a psychoanalytic standpoint. I'm sure you would have many questions. Write to them at hvindia@gmail.com. I'm not regular on YouTube. Mail me if you need clarification. Thank you.